House to order and congratulate all teams on making it to finals of the North American Championship 2007.
Seated on the left and representing Canada, we have from UBC, the Prime Minister Teddy Harrison and the Minister of the Crown, Ashish Sinha. And seated on the right and representing America, we have Yale GW with the Leader of the Opposition, Matt Wansley, and the member opposite, Dylan Gadek.
All right. Then I call this House to order again, you rowdy people, and call upon the Honorable Prime Minister to deliver the first constructive speech of the round. Here. Are you extended? Extended? Yeah. 7.
Wait, you want 7 or 6?
He's not extended.
No, the Prime Minister.
Please proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The resolution before the House today is that this House believes child soldiers who escape from rebel groups should be permitted to fight for government forces. A resolution we heartily support on-side government. Our model's pretty simple. We're going to talk about this in principle. We're not going to set it in any one specific country. We're going to say that we should make this the choice of the individuals, the choice of the child soldiers, whether they would like to try rehabilitation and integration back into society, or whether they would like to try rehabilitation and integration into the government forces. We're also going to put a couple of conditions on this. We don't think they're controversial. We think the only thing they cut out is uninteresting debate. The first condition is that these are the only children who will be used in government forces. We don't think government forces should create child soldiers. We think they should deal with the reality of child soldiers. The second is that you will use these children in appropriate ways. Cannon fodder is not the purpose of our plan. What arguments do we have for you? I'm going to talk to you about innocence and whether you can actually restore it. I'm going to talk to you about the fact that they often don't have any home to return to. And then I'm going to talk to you about the Army as rehabilitation. First off, let's deal briefly with the unpleasant and horrible reality of child soldiers. The recruiting mechanisms of groups like the Lord's Resistance Army, like the rebel groups in West Africa, that do use child soldiers, is to kidnap these soldiers from their homes and then initiate them through horrible procedures, through making them kill other children, through making them kill their own parents, through making them do horrible things, initiate them into the cult of the rebel group. So what we essentially have is we have children whose innocence has been stolen from them and destroyed. Children who are in fact soldiers and in many ways are no longer children. The question is, what can you do when they escape from that group? What can you do when they don't buy into the ideology, when they have made it away from that and would like to fight for government forces? What do you do in that situation? Can you give them their childhood back? Can you give them their innocence back? We're going to say mostly no. We're not going to say shut down all the NGOs that are making noble efforts to try and do this. We're going to say their success rate has been abysmal, and in certain cases, it's just not about to happen.
So, because you can't restore their innocence, you should reinforce the horrors of taking another man's life as a child.
Yeah, no. Obviously, it's a difficult position that you're stuck in when you turn children into killing machines. Obviously, you're not dealing with ideal situations. But what we're going to say is we don't think that kind of rehabilitation is going to be successful, particularly in cases where they have these psychological problems that they can't deal with because they have been forced to do all of these things. So we don't think you can really unmake these children as soldiers, and we don't think you can remake them as children. They're also don't really have anywhere to return to that's not an army at this point. They can't, in many cases, return to their homes. We think there might be a chance of successful rehabilitation if they do have a loving home to return to, if they are working that way. However, we don't think it's reasonable when you're dealing with a situation where they may have killed their own parents. So in those circumstances, they can't return home to their own village because they have been the perpetrator of violence and horrors against their own communities. We also think that it's very difficult, the empirical evidence shows that it's very difficult to rehabilitate these people into society, train them for other occupations, and give them any kind of reasonable life chances for the rest of their life because they have been so indoctrinated and so created as a soldier. Which brings us to our third argument, which may explain why we're taking the difficult route of continuing to have them as soldiers continuing to have them potentially kill people. What we're going to say is that we see the Army as the best chance for rehabilitation. Because, Mr. Speaker, we do have armies in our country. We do teach people to kill other people. That is something that we are willing to accept as a harm in our society. The question is, who is perpetrating the harm on the child? What we think you have as a situation with these child soldiers is they have already been unmade as children and created as soldiers. So you're not exploiting children by going out and recruiting children and putting them in your army. You're taking someone who's already a soldier, whose life in that sense has already been destroyed, and giving them some prospects for rehabilitation, some prospects for life chances within the army. What do we think? Why do we think it's better? It's because it's a military hierarchy environment that they're used to dealing with, that they can incorporate into. Yes, there are differences between the legitimate government forces and the rebel groups. That's the rehabilitation part as you adapt to those differences. There are differences in the code of ethics as you adapt to being forced to kill your parents, into following the laws of war, following things, not being forced into committing atrocities, all that kind of thing. Furthermore, we think this is important for the empowerment of the children, because we think the big issue with child soldiers is exploitation, the power imbalances, all that kind of stuff. You don't want to be recruiting child soldiers because they don't know what they're getting themselves into. They've already been made soldiers. What we think you do now, by allowing them, if they so choose, to join the military, is you give them some level of empowerment. You give them level of empowerment, furthermore, that help their rehabilitation. Because if they are able to defend the communities that they were forced to perpetrate violence against, that creates a sense of personal atonement that is helpful for their psychological rehabilitation. It also creates a sense of empowerment, which is part of the indoctrination into being a child soldier in the first place, is you're taken from a situation of having no power, given a gun, given some power, and that's how they get you. What we're saying that happens in this situation is you continue to give them some level of power. We think if you just send them back to their communities when they're used to getting whatever they want by pointing a gun at somebody, that's bad for them and their chances of rehabilitating and learning how you work in society. It's also bad for society. We think this is the best way to protect society from the returning child soldiers, because you control their violence the same way you control the violence of anybody in a military hierarchy. So, Mr. Speaker, what are we telling you? We're telling you that we're dealing with one of the worst situations other than genocide I can think of, which is child soldiers, the creation of child soldiers. But we're telling you that we're not creating them. We're dealing with that. We're trying to find the best way to reintegrate them into society. And we think, given their experiences, given what they have been created as, the best way to do that is to put them into the Army. That's why we propose.
Thank the Speaker for his remarks, and call upon the Honorable Leader of the Opposition to deliver the next constructive speech. Hear, hear.
So, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister gets up here and he says the problem with being a child soldier is there's this exploitation. But we're not going to exploit people on our side of the house. These are people who are already child soldiers. We're actually just helping them out by putting them in the Army. But the second argument he gives you is, listen, these people have no other options. They don't have a home at all. They don't have anywhere to go back to. He's basically saying they're in a desperate situation. The government should take advantage of this and put them in the Army. That's a definition of exploitation. That's what they're defending on their side of the house. We have three arguments off case. First, we think this is an absolute rights violation. First, we believe that the only way someone can ever be asked to participate in the military, put their own life at risk, and kill the lives of others is if they can make a rational decision. We think there are several reasons for why these children can't do it. First, they're just far too young. Every society recognizes that they aren't matured enough to make this type of decision. Secondly, they're probably psychologically damaged and scarred by being child soldiers in the past, so they're not in the right state of mind to make the decision. Thirdly, as they suggest on their side of the house, they have very few other options. So as a result, it's not an uncoerced choice. It's a directly coercive choice. Fourthly, governments often aren't any better than the rebel groups that they're fighting against. The rebel groups are just the governments that aren't in power. So what will governments do? They're dealing with an existential threat where they're being killed by the rebel groups and they need more soldiers. Governments will be extremely exploitative and will take these soldiers and pressure them very hard to take them because they need them for the government's own interest. So this choice is a choice that people are completely coerced into. Our second set of arguments about why this is a rights violation is that these people are going to be subject to abuse in the military. Now, they try to get around this with this condition at the beginning of the round, which says they can't be used as cannon fodder. They have to be used in appropriate ways. I think as much as they would like that to be the case, this is going to be impossible to enforce. There are good reasons to this. First, they're significantly less effective soldiers because they're just not as physically capable. And secondly, they can't object to orders because they can easily be overpowered by their leaders and by the adults in the army. What are the consequences of this? They can't refuse unjust orders, so they are likely to be put in situations where they might think that what they're doing is morally wrong, something they wouldn't want to do, but they have no option of getting out once they're stuck in the military. But secondly, though, they're going to be sent on the most high-risk missions. Because they have the least to lose by losing the lives of these children soldiers, those are going to be the ones that they send to the worst type of missions. But finally, under this argument, we think there are moral reasons for why children should never be soldiers. First, their lives are the most costly to lose because they have the most less to live. So you create a greater harm when you kill a child in the military or put them, at greater risk of dying. But secondly, though, they're the least able to influence the political situation. And as a result, they were least likely to be responsible for the conflict that started. They had no influence over this in the first place. So I think there are real moral harms to having children do this. All right, I'll take you.
Okay, whether or not they created the conflict, a lot of them feel some guilt for their part in their side of the conflict. Why not let them atone for that by correcting and fighting for the
By killing people on the other side? Is that really how you atone for guilt, right? It's like, well, I killed some of them, let me kill some more of them, then it's all even, right? Then I haven't done an injustice in the universe. That's an absurd argument. All right, we have two more offensive arguments off case. First is this damages the future of that government society for two important reasons. All right, first, since children soldiers are less effective soldiers, and they're going to be sent on high-risk missions, they're likely to die in higher numbers. The consequence of this is it kills off a generation of economic productivity. The consequence of this is when the post-conflict scenario comes around, you have a whole generation that can't get jobs, and you can't rebuild your economy after the war. This really makes it impossible, to rebuild your society. But secondly, though, if you create and reinforce on their side of the house these people whose only skill are fighting, that's going to be problematic. Why? Because they had no chance at an education, because they actually are relatively more skilled as soldiers. The consequence of that is, where are they going to be able to get a job? Mercenary groups, and guess what? Potential rebels in the future when they go back to the Rebel Army, because the Rebel Army gives them a job that the government can't afford. But also, here's the really problematic thing. They make some arguments about reducing violence on their side of the house. If you put these children in the army for a second time, you only exacerbate their violent tendencies. You show them that violence is the only option for them. As a result, they're more likely to feed in criminal street gangs that bring down the fabric of society. No, thank you. Our third argument off case is about how this isn't even in the interest of government for four reasons. First of all, these people haven't demonstrated their loyalty in any way. They just wanted to get out of one army, try to get in another army, so they have a better chance of surviving. That means they're highly likely to be spies, and it's very difficult to determine whether or not these children are or aren't spies. Secondly, though, we all remember that weak soldiers endangered entire units. That is, units live or fall on their lowest common denominator. So as a result of that, entire units are now more subject to harm because they have these weak soldiers that are bringing them down. Thirdly, though, you lose the moral high ground in the internal civil conflict. That is, people who might be leaving with the rebels but are staying with you because at least you don't abuse children are now going to go over to the rebel side because they'll be like, listen, they're both child abusers. Let's just go with the side that we like. Finally, though, this totally screws over your international situation. You'll never get support from people in the international community, either diplomatically, politically, or in terms of arms. Why? Because you're violating the Convention on the Rights of Child, which everyone in the developed world has signed, and you're a pariah regime. Everyone recognizes that the governments that have children are government soldiers or governments who wouldn't want to support. Let me look at their arguments. They give you the argument that you can't restore the innocence of these children. That's obviously true. But what about having already been a child soldier makes it okay to force people to be child soldiers again, right? No, obviously now we're not going to bring back their innocent childhood, but at least give them a relatively innocent teenage years, right? Right. So then they make this argument, no thank you, that other forms of rehabilitation won't work. He says there's an empirical evidence. This is an empirical assertion without any substantiation or an analytic claim. But secondly, though, it's certainly not a comparative argument, right? There can't be a better form of rehabilitation, putting them back into the military. We haven't heard arguments about that. Then they make this argument that you don't have a home. You may have killed your own parents. Listen, if you think these kids are totally screwed, should we conscript orphan children, right? Like, presumably they still have a chance of making it in society. Yes, it's going to be very difficult for them. I bet it'll be more difficult if they stick in the military and never have any exposure to regular family life. But as I said in my overview, this actually is the definition of exploitation. The final argument that they give you is about how this is a good form of rehabilitation. It says it gives them a job, but it gives them a dead-end job, right? That they can only transfer these skills to other military organizations, like being in another rebel group or being a mercenary. And then And then they just say, listen, people after wars can never readjust. Yes, it's very difficult to adjust, but I actually think after most wars, we do have soldiers who go on to important positions in society. Yes, it is more difficult if you're a child soldier, but saying it's difficult to adjust doesn't mean we shouldn't give these children a chance. Then they make this argument about atonement. They think the way to make up the wrong you've done is more killing. Listen, if they actually accept that ideology, then you're going to get a culture where cycles of violence, vendettas, and revenge are ingrained in your society. Because they think the way to atone for killings is more killings. Finally, they say control their violence by putting them in the military. Listen, I think what we should try and do is make these children less violent. I think there are ways to do that. We somehow managed to rehabilitate criminals, people who actually intended to do violence, rather than people who were just coerced into doing violence. We have no reason to believe that these children want to be violent. They're just forced to be violent. Who wants to force them to be violent again? Those guys. We oppose.
Thank the Leader of the Opposition for his eloquent remarks, and now I call upon the member of the government, not the crowd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to talk about exactly the problem that we have with opposition benches in my first point. Because the problem that we have is they keep on referring to the developed world, the modern state. They keep on referring to this mythical state that applies to every single country. What I want to talk about is the point of child protections in the developed world and the difference between that and fragile states and phantom states, which we are talking about. What they're talking about is the use of child protections to provide a nurturing environment where these children can become self-actualizing citizens of the country, where they can be able to get the sort of services of the government, where they can live with the sort of parental consent, with the parental responsibility to help those children gain access to education. The difference, Mr. Speaker, is that that is not the reality of these countries. The reality of these countries is that the government has failed to act. The government is not able to secure these children's rights. They're not able to secure the communities. And when the government fails to act, it has no right to mandate to children what they can and cannot do to provide their own ends, their own life-sustaining acts. And in that case, Mr. Speaker, we argue that children have to be able to make the option, make the conscious decision, because the government cannot, because the community will often not accept them, make the conscious decision to go back into that military, to atone for whatever they have done, and be able to defend their communities from a danger that is very real, that is hurting their communities, and if they go back to those communities, will likely conscript them again. This is the point of child protection, an actual practical end, not a philosophical justification that has no tangible benefits. And this goes to Teddy's major 3 points, because I want to talk about the justification Teddy offered, because it shows the reality of the situation, not some sort of mythos of rights that do not apply. What he said in his first argument is talking about why innocence cannot be granted. The actual situation in these countries is that you have a government that is not existing throughout the entire country. They're not able to provide protections throughout the entire country. They're not actually a legitimate government in most of the country because of the actions of rebel groups. And because of that, they cannot guarantee that the innocents can be returned through whatever rehabilitation they're going to offer. They said it's an assertion that basically using the Army's rehabilitation is the best option. We say it's an assertion that any other type of rehabilitation is going to work, that psychologists are going to be able to talk to these children and be able to help them out with their problems. We think it's much more practical to look at actual case examples. Let's look at Uganda. In Uganda, what is actually happening is that the Lord Resistance Army is oftentimes conscripting people straight from the communities without the government being able to even act. Where is the ability for the community to defend? It isn't there. Where is the ability for the community to accept the children? Oftentimes those children aren't even accepted back in the communities because of the atrocities they're forced to make. Their rebuttal against this, which was really interesting, was saying that if you make an entire generation of soldiers, they're going to have no other skills besides fighting. This is a sad reality of a community that already has these only skills at fighting. These are people who already served in a rebel army group where they were taught only to fight. What happens if they only go back to a community with only those skill sets? The same harms that they offered will be the same harms that are realized under their side of the plan. What government is offering them is the choice to be able to offer them to defend their community in a productive way. Offer them the chance to be able to atone for their mistakes. And it's not really their mistakes. We're not saying that it is the children's fault. And it is something that they said very interestingly in one of the constructive points, that it's not the children's fault that this happened. We completely agree. But you have to deal with the reality of the situation, not some abstract sense of justice. when the children are not accepted back in the community, when they actually do feel moral outrage against what they did, when they're leaving the Rebel Army because of what happened during that case, they need some sort of outlet to be able to either atone for themselves or be able to defend their communities and be able to sort of justify what happened in their own minds and the skills that they've learned. This is the way that you allow children to self-actualize with the skills that they learned, the terrible skills that they learned, but in a productive manner. And the third point that Teddy talked about, which I thought was a great point, was talking about the societal impacts and sort of using the army as a rehabilitation tool. This sounds really weird, right? You don't use the army as rehabilitation in any developed world because it's not the case that children have other options. But the case here is what opposition benches is offering is an untenable situation for these children. These children have no other option. They have very limited skill sets, and they're being persecuted. We don't think that's a fair option.
How do we know that there's this incredible rehabilitatory effect on these former child soldiers when countries don't do this in the status quo? Government forces don't employ child soldiers.
Yes, they do. Hey, three things now, because he brought that up. First of all, governments do use children soldiers. That's also part of the problem with a lot of those other countries doing it, and the reason the United Nations condemns them. But the point is, why they shouldn't condemn them is really the critical point. The critical point is that the rehabilitation tools available by those governments are very negligible for those actual children. Those children don't have options to go to some rehabilitation facility and become more productive citizens. They don't have communities that accept them. This is a huge point that I don't think they're understanding. And the third point is that these children are oftentimes so outraged and so devastated by what they've done that they don't think that they have any other option but to defend their communities. And oftentimes for those children, like in the case when they've been forced to perform atrocities, the only way for them to provide some sort of link between what they've been forced to do and any positive end is if they're allowed the link between those two and allowed to actually make those actions by working for a government that they agree with. Now I want to get to their points, because they talk about children as not being rational agents. And this is a critical point, because it really underlines the entire philosophy of opposition. Because children are marginalized groups in societies, because they aren't able to make rational decisions, they shouldn't be allowed to make this rational decision for themselves. That works when the government is a legitimate state. That works when the government is offering them actual nurturing environments and actual tenable solutions for their own self-actualization. That isn't the case when you have a failed state, when you have countries that are unable and incapable of being able to offer any sort of tangible goods for these children. And much more importantly, the basic security for those children. We, on the government branches, stand for life-sustaining acts. When in the case of children, if they go back to the communities, they rightfully fear for their own lives, the lives of the family, and the lives of the community. And for that reason, we don't think that stands. The second major theme that we got from them is that the children are responsible for the conflict. It goes in line with the same thing. Sure, it's completely unjust. This really sucks, guys, but that's not the point. The point is actually offering the children the option. Offering them the option either to go back to their community if they think they can do that and if the community accepts them, or offering them an actual tenable outlet for them to be able to defend their communities, for them to actually do something productive with the skills that they've learned, and for them to actually go back to a hierarchy that they can understand, which is the military hierarchy. For these reasons, we stand in proud opposition.
Member of government for his remarks and call upon the member of the opposition to deliver the final constructive speech of the round.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Throughout the MG speech, we saw a really interesting line of argumentation, which is that if you're an oppressive government and you have the option to try and get back to being a good government or continue to be an awful government, always take the latter choice. Never try to do the right thing. Never try to be a good government. We think that simply isn't going to fly, and that just because they happen to be an oppressive government doesn't give them license to continue doing awful things. That said, what we want to do is I want to talk about their observation, and then I want to give my own observation, and then I actually want to get on the case, or as I like to call it, Drop City. Let's talk about their observation. Because their observation is they talk about the developed world and all these social nets, which is really interesting, because the only time Wansley ever said the words developed world was in our third point about how the developed world will never come to your aid if you employ child soldiers. Something that conveniently they dropped. We never made any assumptions that we were only talking about the developed world. We think this observation is silly. But the second observation that we want to make is something that I want to make is something that really goes this is a really bizarre line of argumentation, which they keep saying, why don't you just give these kids the choice? Why don't you just let them decide for themselves? Well, if that's true, explain your first caveat. If you think children are capable of making the decision to join the Army, why not open this to every single child? Presumably, if children are capable of choosing, then they should be able to choose even if they didn't happen to be in the Army. In fact, it should probably go the opposite way, because people in the Army are incredibly messed up psychologically, and they have to do things like kill their family. These are the people we should least trust with that choice, Mr. Speaker. This is going to be a huge problem. So now let's get on to sort of like the rights our argument about rights violation. Their only good argument against this, and I call it good, but it's not really, is that these rights don't really exist in the developed world. Wansley and I think that's just like absolute rubbish. Of course these rights still exist. There's still things like the declarations of rights. You should still be working towards actually trying to do these things. That just because you're in a present government doesn't give you license to do whatever you want to do. But furthermore, when we get to the second point, we're going to show you why this is really nasty for the children, why you're really taking advantage of them. Because they completely dropped the second point about all this stuff about child soldiers, how they're really likely to be put in the absolute worst areas, both morally and physically, where they have to either commit atrocities or possibly get killed. That means that lots of these kids are making choices that they don't realize, that if they knew for a fact that they were going to be put in that situation, they'd choose not to. What was the first thing they said? How did they set up the case? They said you can either go through normal rehabilitation programs, which they then later say don't exist, so we're unsure what exactly their case is, or you can go through rehabilitation through the military. What they're giving you is a false choice because they're lying to these kids about what rehabilitation through the military is. It's not this like great thing where you're not in jeopardy. It's where you have a high risk of dying and have a high risk of committing these really awful acts, those kind of acts that really scar people and keep them from becoming productive members of society later on in life. But furthermore, what they do is they completely drop our third point, which is going to be a huge argument in the round, because even if we want to take their perspective on this round and say, fine, we'll just look at it as if you're an oppressive nation, and if you're an oppressive nation, then being oppressive is like really cool. We think that's a wrong argument. But even if we were to accept it, the fact that they completely dropped the third point is going to be absolutely killing for them, because there's 4 big reasons why you wouldn't want to have them. First, there's a really good likelihood that they're going to be spies. That means there's a decent chance that they're going to undermine your military and actually make you less likely to win against this like sort of like Lord's Resistance Army or any other rebel group. If your goal of the government is to win the army, don't allow people who have a high probability of being spies. But second of all, the argument that Wansley makes about how one weak soldier endangers the entire group means that there's no reason the government will actually want to have them in there. The reason that you have them in there with the sort of like the reason that these sort of rebel groups actually conscript them is that they literally have no other choice. They simply don't have the bodies. But what we say is that government armies tend to actually have the necessary bodies, and only adding in worse people makes them much more likely to be killed. But the last 2 points are the biggest ones on this, is that you lose the moral high ground. That lots of the people who fight in the army do so because they see what the acts of the rebel group are so reprehensible that they're willing to actually fight against them. When they stop seeing that and you're seen as just as reprehensible as they are, they're not going to fight for you anymore.
Okay, do you want these children outside of army control, outside of the hierarchy of the military, and with that violent attitude that's been inculcated in them?
Alright, here's what we would say, is that having them sort of like doing nothing, be on the street, is better than having them in the army. We think that these like minor social net programs that you give us are going to be better than actually reinforced in the army. Because when they're out on the street, there's at least some possibility that they actually can do this, that they actually can be rehabilitated. We think that all the arguments about the street gangs are just as likely to happen on your side of the house, but furthermore that you're going to re-entrench these conflicts. Why? Because you're saying, well, at least we're giving them a job. But this is a job that has a relatively short shelf life, Mr. Speaker, because it only goes until the conflict's over. So wait, what is there an incentive to do? Exacerbate the conflict. Make the conflict go on as long as possible. Because as long as we're fighting the rebels, as long as we're fighting someone, I've always got a job. At that point, they're only reinforcing these cycles of violence. They're only creating more violent people in the future. But the last point I want to argue about how you lose all your international support is going to be huge. Because lots of times if you're this government group, one of your only chances is to have the U.S. come to your aid, give you things like military aid or sort of like helicopters or like decreased trade sanctions to actually help you have the economic viability to actually fight these people. When you don't have this, you put yourself in a significantly worse off situation. That said, let's look at their side of the case. When we actually look at their first 2 points, these aren't points to vote for them. The fact that you can't completely restore innocence or they don't have a homeland is not a reason to put them in the army at all. The only arguments they ever give you that could be reasons to vote on their side is the rehabilitation arguments. These rehabilitation rehabilitation arguments simply aren't going to fly, because the reason these people are so messed up psychologically is they've had to do all these sorts of killings. What Wansley tells you is, it's true they've had an awful childhood. Don't continue on this path and give them an awful teenagehood also. We think that the fact of the matter is that when you actually remove yourself from the violence, that you actually can have some sort of cathartic effect. You can actually see what you did was wrong, that this atonement for violence by further violence only entrenches cycles of violence. We think that you're not going to get these people be any psychologically better if they actually are doing this fighting. We think that this simply is absolutely silly, because the reason they feel so bad about this is that they killed other people, they committed these atrocities, something that they're significantly likely to do because they don't have the ability to object when they're given these awful orders. The only thing they want to tell you on their side of the house, that's a good reason, is we may as well have them where we can control them. What we tell you is that you shouldn't be taking advantage of these children. You shouldn't be putting them in situations where they can die, especially when the long-term ramifications are more war, less likely to win this war, and you're just going to create the same sort of violence, the same sort of street gangs by raising an army of children that have no skill but to fight. They tell you that they can't get jobs in any other way. Well, guess what? Lots of uneducated men who only know how to fight are the kind of people that fight for resources later. They're the kind of people who join the RUF or create the RUF and try to take diamond mines later. Don't mire yourself in continuous series of conflicts. We probably oppose.
I thank the member of opposition for his remarks. Now call upon the leader of the opposition to deliver the first rebuttal speech of the round with all of the usual caveats and warnings. Here.
Mr. Speaker, I know they say you don't have to go down the flow in Canada, but I've been in a lot of good debate rounds against good Canadian teams. And not going down the flow doesn't mean ignoring everything we say on a case and dropping 2/3 of our 24 arguments that we gave you in LSC. So I think we're structurally out of this round. And I'm shocked that the MG just decided to talk about how great it is to rehabilitate people by having them kill other people for 8 minutes. All right, Mr. Speaker, all I want to do first in this speech is deal with their offense, and then I'll return to ours. So their offense seems to be 3 important points: rehabilitation, atonement, and controlling the environment. Here's the problem with the rehabilitation argument. As I tell you in LOC, they're never comparative. All they say is that other rehabilitation programs won't work. But we've said putting them back into the military only furthers the violent message and tendencies they get and make them think that's the only way they can survive in life. Never reintegrates them back into regular society, shows them what regular life or a real job is difficult to get. We have a second set of responses, which is really dropped, and I think it's really important, which is all this does is put the rehabilitation problem off down the road, right? You can put them in the military for another 4 years, but then they're going to be out of the military, and you're still going to have to try and control them so they won't be violent. You're still going to have to try and rehabilitate them, but you can't do that. Why? Because you've just furthered their violent tendencies. So then they make this argument about atonement. I think I've ridiculed this enough. All I'd say is they've never responded to our claim. This ingrains the idea of cyclical violence, and it changes the fabric of society in a bad way, because people will never believe in the rule of law because they realize the way to solve conflicts is violence. Then they make this argument about controlling them. Listen, you can't control them indefinitely, and I don't think that killing them off in the army is the way to prevent them from committing crime. Finally, I gave you this argument about orphan children. How, yes, it's a difficult situation for them, but some of them manage to survive in society. I gave you this argument about people in the military who fought wars in the country that were very psychologically damaging. They still managed to be successful in society somehow. Dylan makes another great argument here, which is if you really think that this is a conscious choice that people should be able to make, then why are we extending this to all child soldiers and just people who have been in the military? So now I'd like to respond to our arguments. Now, here are the arguments we gave you. We said this was a rights violation. On their side of the house, they said, well, those only apply to legitimate government. Mr. Speaker, look at the nature of that response. He's like, governments in the third world have every right to be oppressive because they're not legitimate. Well, we're saying in our house, they should try to become legitimate. They should try and make progress as far as it's possible to them. So they keep using this rhetoric of conscious choice. If you were going to make that rhetoric, you should have responded to any of the 4 arguments we gave you about why this is an extremely coercive choice and people aren't making it fairly. But I'd also like to point out the moral arguments here, which I think are really important. Remember I gave you this argument about how children are the worst to die in war because they have the most to lose, because they have the most to live if they survive. And also that they can't influence the political situation, so they have no guilt. The response that we get from the member of the Crown was telling. He was like, this is verbatim, this really sucked. Yeah, it really sucks. That's why we're on this side of the bench, not that side of the bench. That's not an excuse for the case you're proposing. Listen, even if you think that this isn't a moral issue, and it's purely about the government winning the war, I just draw your attention to 4 arguments which never get a response. These children are highly likely to be spies who will underline the military. One weak soldier brings down a unit and endangers them all because units fall to the lowest common denominator. Third, they lose the moral high ground. People turn to the rebels. This dampens recruitment and hurts the government. Finally, international pressure. You'll never get diplomatic or political support. You'll never get arms. You'll lose the war.
Call upon the Prime Minister to finish off the round with similar warnings and caveats. Here.
Mr. Speaker, we didn't respond to all 24 points because there were 24 of them and we wanted to have an interesting round of debate. It's the same reason that we put forward the case that we put forward in the first place. That we talked about these being the only child soldiers, not that we like child soldiers in general, and that we talked about using them appropriately in the military. Because obviously, if you have 2 morally equivalent fighting forces, transferring child soldiers back and between before them is silly, and there's no interesting debate there. The interesting debate is when you're rehabilitating them, if you have an option, the option that we're proposing, that is that governments do take these soldiers in with a rehabilitative in mind, not to make them cannon fodder, is that morally justified? We think there's plenty on their side. That's what I'm going to engage with in these last few minutes. What we want to talk about is what are the options for these people? Realistically, what are the options in this situation? Is the Army better than the rebel groups? I've already told you that that's the case we're going to presume, that's the case we're going to work within, is that the Army is offering a better option to them than the rebel groups are. That they're not going to say, force them to go home and kill their parents and that kind of thing. We also think that the Army is a better option for these people than society. We talked about the fact that they can't go home because people there are angry at them, because they burned down their home, because they killed people there. That they're not safe when they go home because of retaliation from their own community, and they're not safe because the government can't guarantee that they won't be taken by the rebels and forced back into rebel armies in the first place. We think the fact of the government's inability to guarantee these people a childhood in the first place is morally relevant, and we've talked about that throughout this round. That's why we're talking about choice. That's why the choice is different for these soldiers than any other soldier. I told you right at the beginning, we don't really think they're children at all anymore. We think they've been made into soldiers. We think the choice that they are making, the choice that we are offering them in this case today, is the choice of whether to continue to be a soldier and be in the Army, or be a soldier who's trying unsuccessfully to fit into the rest of society. That's why it's a choice we accept. That's why we ignore a lot of the irrelevant matter about the coercive nature of the choice. We think the coercion happened. You have to deal with the fact that the coercion happened. By banning one of the possible choices of the children, that is, saying you can't be in the Army, you're not correcting for the coercion. You're presuming that there is a correct choice and an incorrect choice. We're not willing to presume that the incorrect choice and the protection of the interests of the child is being in the Army. That's why we told you we think they should be in the Army. We think it's in their interests to be in the Army. Why is that? All that stuff about their own safety. All the stuff about we do think it's a better way for rehabilitation. You were told we gave you no analysis. What about the analysis along the lines of this is the only way they can psychologically rehabilitate by atoning for the guilt that they naturally feel, even if morally, hypothetically, we don't think it's really their fault. They feel that guilt. This is a way to atone. Not just by going back and instigating a cycle of revenge, but by protecting the very communities that they hurt in the first place. That's the kind of possible rehabilitation we think there. Mr. Speaker, essentially what we have to ask you is how far do we realistically think you can rehabilitate a child who was forced to kill their parents? We just don't think you're ever going to get that rehabilitation to normal functioning member of society. We think you just might get that rehabilitation to functioning member of the military to the level of soldier. They told you that's only a stopgap because you'll just throw these people out of the military once the conflict's over. I mean, one, the conflicts last a really long time. Two, people have militaries in peacetime. Like, you guys are going to say, we have a crappy tiny little one, but we don't think you have to throw them out of the military. We don't think it's a dead end. Well, we do think it's a dead end job. We think it's a dead end job that will continue for the rest of their life and offer them superior life chances to throwing them out onto the street. We don't think that we're postponing that. We think we're just never going to actually do that. You keep them in the military. That's the best case scenario we can realistically see us getting to in this situation. Finally, they told you, oh, terrible backlash. The rest of the world, they'll just abandon you. Look, we only think that's the case if we fail to convince you as judges on everything else. We think it's the same as the other thing. able to convince you that putting him in the military is the good option in these circumstances, then we think that you'll be able to convince the rest of the world that it was the good option and it was the right way to go.